Close your eyes and imagine this. It's dawn in medieval London, 1348. A hooded figure walks through empty streets, and every door slams shut at his approach. Children are pulled inside by terrified mothers. Even priests cross themselves and look away. This man isn't a leper, a criminal, or a demon. He's something far worse in the eyes of medieval society. He's the executioner. And tonight, you're going to discover why his life was more brutal than the deaths he delivered. Let the gentle crackling of this fireside carry you into a world where justice wore a hood and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Tonight, we step into the lonely world of medieval Europe's most isolated souls, where duty and damnation walked hand in hand. The executioner's day began before the sun kissed the horizon, in a small, crooked house at the very edge of town, always. At the edge, never within the community proper, a man would wake to complete silence. There were no church bells for him, no morning prayers shared with neighbors, no friendly greetings over garden fences. His existence began and ended in solitude. His name might have been Thomas, or Guillaume, or Heinrich, but it didn't matter. To everyone else, he was simply the executioner, the hangman, or more often, nothing at all. A ghost in broad daylight. A necessary evil that polite society pretended didn't exist until they desperately needed him. Picture him now, this hooded figure, as he rises from his straw mattress. The first thing he feels isn't the cold morning air or the ache in his joints from yesterday's work. It's the weight, not the physical weight of his professional duties. Those were merely obligations. It's the invisible weight of every soul whose final moments he had witnessed, every family he had left grieving, every community gathering he had presided over in his official capacity. He dresses slowly, methodically. First the rough spun shirt, then the leather jerkin, and finally, always finally, the hood. That black or brown cloth isn't just a disguise. It's a barrier between him and a world that sees him as something less than human. When he pulls it over his face, he transforms from a man into a symbol, from a person into a function. As he steps outside his hovel, the transformation is complete. The street that might have bustled with merchants and farmers just minutes ago falls silent. A baker quickly closes his shutters. A mother snatches her playing child from the path. A merchant turns his cart around and chooses a longer route to a market rather than pass the executioner on the road. This is his morning routine, and it happens the same way, every day for years upon years until death finally claims him too. The isolation isn't just professional. It's total, complete, suffocating. He exists in a bubble of silence so thick that he sometimes forgets what normal human conversation sounds like. But how does a man become the person everyone fears to look upon? How does a human being end up in a profession so reviled that it condemns not just him, but his entire family line to generations of disgrace? The truth is both simpler and more heartbreaking than you might imagine. Most executioners didn't choose their fate. They inherited it, like a family trade. But instead of learning carpentry or blacksmithing, they learned the administrative aspects of capital punishment, the legal procedures surrounding their work, and the psychological techniques necessary to survive in complete social isolation. Young boys, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, would watch their fathers and grandfathers at work, learning that the family business involved things other children couldn't even imagine. They learned to read legal documents, to understand court procedures, to recognize the signs of guilt and innocence in human faces. They learned to steady their emotions when crowds gathered for justice, and to steel their hearts when the condemned pleaded for mercy they had no power to give. Other executioners came to the profession through legal obligation. A man might be appointed by local authorities when no hereditary executioner was available. A debtor might find his only path to freedom lay through accepting this unwanted position. A soldier who had served in legal capacities might be assigned to civilian justice roles. Some, heartbreakingly, were simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time. A young man might assist with legal proceedings, only to be told by a desperate local lord that he was now responsible for future justice administration. A farmer might help with community law enforcement, only to discover he'd just volunteered for a lifetime of such grim service. And once you became an executioner, there was no going back. No retirement, no career change, no escape. The position was yours until death claimed you, and then it would pass to your eldest son, or your brother, or whoever was unlucky enough to be closest to you when you drew your final breath. The appointment ceremony itself was often a traumatic experience. New executioners would stand before local authorities while their duties were explained in clinical detail. They would receive their official documents, their professional equipment, and their first assignments. The ceremony marked the end of their old lives and the beginning of something entirely different, something that couldn't really be called living in any normal sense. Let's step inside the executioner's home, because even the most feared man in town needs somewhere to sleep, somewhere to eat, somewhere to try to find a moment's peace in a life devoid of comfort. The house is small, cramped, and built just far enough from town that respectable people don't have to see it from their windows. There are no neighbors dropping by for tea, no children playing in the yard, no merchants stopping to sell their wares. The executioner's home exists in a bubble of isolation so complete it might as well be on another continent. The walls are thick, not for warmth, but to muffle sounds, because sometimes late at night, when the weight of his profession becomes too much to bear, the executioner weeps, deep, silent sobs that shake his entire body, tears for every life that has passed through his hands, every family he has left broken, every moment of human connection he has sacrificed on the altar of duty. His furniture is crude, handmade, because no carpenter in town will take his money. His clothes are patched and repatched, because no tailor will serve him. His food is whatever he can grow himself or hunt in the forests, because most merchants refuse his coin, believing it carries a curse. In one corner of his single room stands his professional documentation, legal scrolls outlining his duties and authorities, official seals that grant him power over life and death, appointment letters from nobles and magistrates. These documents are the only possessions he owns that connect him to legitimate authority. Yet they are also the source of all his suffering, and in another corner, hidden beneath loose floorboards or tucked behind a stone, lies his most precious possession: money. Not just the payment he receives for his services, but coins he's saved, penny by penny, for a dream that will never come true. The dream of buying his way out of his profession, of starting over somewhere new, of becoming just another face in a crowd, instead of the face that haunts an entire town's nightmares. But medieval society doesn't work that way. You cannot buy your way out of being an executioner any more than you can buy your way out of being born. The position is a life sentence, and everyone knows it. The executioner's home is filled with symbols of his isolation. No family portraits hang on the walls because no artist will paint him. No religious icons bless the space because priests consider his dwelling contaminated. No flowers grow in his garden because even plants seem to wither under the weight of his profession. Yet within this space of rejection and isolation, the executioner tries to create something resembling a normal life. He maintains routines that give structure to his days. He cares for whatever animals will tolerate his presence, often only crows and rats, creatures that other people also consider unclean. He reads when he can find books, writes when he can obtain paper, prays when he can find the strength. The contrast between the executioner's public role and his private humanity is nowhere more evident than in his home. Outside, he is a symbol of death and state power. Inside, he is simply a man trying to find meaning and comfort in circumstances that offer neither. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the executioner's life wasn't what it did to him personally, but what it did to everyone he loved. His wife, if he was lucky enough to find one, and very few were, lived under the same cloud of suspicion and revulsion. She couldn't go to market without whispers following her. She couldn't attend church without other women moving away from her in the pews. Her children, if she bore any, were marked from birth as the offspring of society's official outcast. Imagine being a child in a medieval village and learning that your father's occupation makes you untouchable. Other children won't play with you. Their parents forbid them from even speaking to you. You can't apprentice to any trade, because no master craftsman will take on the child of an executioner. You can't marry into any respectable family, because who would want their bloodline tainted by association with your father's work? The executioner's children grew up knowing that their future was predetermined. The sons would likely become executioners themselves, continuing the grim family tradition. The daughters, if they married at all, would marry into other disgraced families, perhaps the children of tanners, who worked with dead animal flesh, or grave diggers, or others whose professions put them on the fringes of society. Some executioners tried to break the cycle. They sent their children away to distant cities, hoping they could start new lives where the family name held no meaning. But medieval Europe was a small world, and news traveled. A child might spend years building a new identity, only to have someone from their hometown recognize them and destroy everything they'd worked to build. Others tried to hide their profession entirely. They told their children they were soldiers, or magistrates, or any occupation that might explain their occasional absences and the way people looked at them. But children aren't fools, and eventually the truth always came out. The weight of this family curse was perhaps the heaviest burden an executioner carried. It's one thing to sacrifice your own happiness for duty, but quite another to know that your mere existence condemns everyone you love to a life of shame and isolation. Executioner families developed unique coping mechanisms for dealing with multi-generational trauma. They created internal support systems that replaced the community connections denied to them by society. Children learned from an early age to rely only on family members, to trust only those who shared their stigma. These families often developed distinctive cultural practices that helped them maintain identity and dignity despite social rejection. They might create private ceremonies to mark important life events, develop family traditions that didn't require community participation, or maintain extensive correspondence with other executioner families in distant regions. The psychological impact on children was particularly severe. They grew up understanding that their family was different, wrong somehow, dangerous in ways they didn't fully comprehend. They learned to read social cues with extraordinary sensitivity, becoming expert at detecting hostility, fear, and rejection in others' behavior. Many executioner children developed anxiety disorders that persisted throughout their lives. They might become hypervigilant about social interactions, constantly alert for signs of discovery or rejection. Others might become withdrawn and antisocial, protecting themselves from potential hurt by avoiding human contact altogether. The educational challenges faced by executioner families were substantial. Most schools wouldn't accept their children, and private tutoring was expensive and difficult to arrange. Many executioner children grew up functionally illiterate, limited in their ability to pursue alternative careers, even if such opportunities had been available to them. While executioners were social outcasts, they were often surprisingly well compensated for their services. This created a strange paradox. Men who couldn't buy acceptance in society because of how they earned their money, yet who often earned more money than many respectable craftsmen. Payment for legal duties varied widely depending on the region, the complexity of cases, and the social status of those involved. A simple proceeding might earn the executioner a few silver coins, while complex legal matters involving nobility could provide enough money to live comfortably for months. In addition to their base fees, executioners often received additional compensation from various sources. They typically received allowances for maintaining official equipment and facilities. They might charge fees for administrative services related to their duties. Some executioners supplemented their income by serving in other legal capacities, handling documentation and record-keeping for additional payment. The executioner's monopoly on certain official services also provided economic opportunities. In many regions, only the executioner was authorized to handle specific legal procedures, operate certain types of official businesses, or engage in trades considered necessary but undesirable by guild standards. These side businesses could provide steady income between major assignments. However, the executioner's wealth came with significant hidden costs. He typically paid double or triple normal prices for goods and services, if he could obtain them at all. His social isolation meant he couldn't participate in the economic networks that other merchants relied on. No guild membership, no trade. Partnerships, no business referrals from satisfied customers. The executioner also faced unique security challenges. His profession was controversial not just because of its nature, but because of the constant threat of retaliation from families. Affected by his work or political opponents who disagreed with legal decisions, he couldn't rely on neighbors for help during emergencies, couldn't count on community support during illness or injury. Many executioners accumulated substantial wealth over their careers, but found themselves unable to enjoy it in conventional ways. They couldn't invest in respectable businesses, couldn't buy their way into social acceptance, couldn't use their money to improve their family's social standing. The wealth became a form of gilded cage, comfortable, but ultimately meaningless. Some executioners tried to use their money to escape their profession. They would attempt to buy their way out of contracts, pay others to take their place, or relocate to distant regions where they might start new lives. But these attempts rarely succeeded. Medieval legal systems didn't easily release executioners from their obligations, and the administrative skills that made someone effective in this role weren't readily transferable to other professions. Even executioners needed to eat, and that meant occasional trips to market. These excursions were exercises in carefully choreographed avoidance and barely contained hostility. Thus, executioner would typically rise before dawn for market trips, hoping to complete his business before the crowds grew thick. He would pull his hood low over his face and keep to the shadows, moving quickly from stall to stall with minimal conversation. Most merchants wouldn't serve him directly. Instead, they would conduct transactions through intermediaries, perhaps a brave servant or a distant relative who was willing to risk association with the executioner for a few coins. The executioner would stand at a distance while his agent negotiated prices and selected goods. When direct interaction was unavoidable, the conversations were brief and conducted in harsh whispers. 2 pounds of flour, coins placed on the counter without touching hands. Keep the change. A quick nod and immediate departure. No pleasantries, no inquiries about family, no discussion of the weather or local events. Some merchants would serve executioners but charge them double or triple the normal price. This wasn't just greed. It was a form of social punishment, a way of expressing disapproval without outright refusal. The executioner paid these inflated prices without complaint, knowing that argument would only draw more unwanted attention. Children. At market posed a particular challenge. They hadn't yet learned to fear the executioner the way adults did, and their curiosity could be dangerous. A child might point and ask loudly, "Mama, is that the man who works for the court?" The resulting commotion, mothers snatching their children away, merchants suddenly refusing service, crowds gathering to stare, could turn a simple shopping trip into a humiliating ordeal. The executioner learned to navigate these social minefields with extraordinary care. He developed strategies for minimizing his visibility while still conducting necessary business. He learned to read facial expressions and body language with remarkable accuracy, predicting which merchants might serve him and which would refuse market. Days served as regular reminders of the executioner's social position. No matter how much money he carried, no matter how politely he conducted himself, no matter how many years he had served the community faithfully, he remained an outsider. His profession had marked him as permanently other, forever excluded from the normal rhythms of medieval life. These shopping expeditions also provided the executioner's only regular contact with the broader community. Through careful observation, he could learn about local events, social changes, and political developments that affected his work. He became an expert reader of social moods and community tensions, skills that were essential for his professional. Survival religion presented a unique dilemma for medieval executioners. In an age when faith permeated every aspect of daily life, the executioner found himself in an impossible theological position. The Church's teachings emphasized mercy, forgiveness, and the sanctity of human life. Yet the executioner's work required him to participate in activities that seemed to contradict these core principles. This created a spiritual crisis that many executioners spent their entire lives trying to reconcile. Some executioners became deeply religious, attending services whenever possible despite the discomfort their presence caused other parishioners. They would sit in the back of churches, heads bowed, trying to find forgiveness for what they saw as necessary but troubling duties they memorized. Prayers and religious texts, seeking guidance for ethical dilemmas that had no clear answers. These religious executioners often developed elaborate personal rituals around their work. They might say specific prayers before each assignment, asking God to provide wisdom and compassion. They might fast before performing official duties, treating their work as a form of penance. Some would donate portions of their fees to the church, hoping to demonstrate their commitment to Christian values. Other executioners took a more pragmatic approach to faith. They reasoned that since they were appointed by divinely ordained rulers, their work must be part of God's plan. Kings ruled by divine right, and if a king ordered legal proceedings, then God must approve of those proceedings. This theological framework allowed them to perform their duties without believing they were committing sins. The relationship between executioners and the church was officially complex, but practically pragmatic. Church doctrines supported capital punishment for certain crimes, and religious authorities often called for legal action against heretics, criminals, and other offenders against God's law, yet individual priests and parishioners frequently treated executioners as contaminated figures, necessary but unclean. Some churches had separate entrances for executioners and their families. Others required them to sit in designated areas, apart from respectable congregants. A few parishes refused to serve executioners at all, forcing them to travel to distant churches where their profession wasn't known. The question of spiritual salvation presented particular theological challenges. Many executioners couldn't receive full religious services despite their official role as servants of justice. They were often excluded from certain sacraments, denied participation in religious festivals, and treated as spiritually compromised by their professional obligations. This religious rejection was perhaps more painful than social ostracism. Medieval people believed deeply in salvation and eternal life, and executioners spent their careers wondering what divine judgment awaited them. They had served earthly justice, but what would happen when they faced heavenly justice? Some executioners found comfort in the belief that they would be judged, not for their actions, but for their intentions. They had served not from malice, but from duty, not for personal gain, but for social order. They hoped that God would see their hearts and understand the burden they had carried. Others lived in constant fear of spiritual consequences. They saw themselves as participating in activities that, regardless of legal authorization, violated divine law. This belief sometimes drove executioners to extreme measures: excessive charity, severe self-punishment, desperate attempts at redemption that never seemed sufficient to ease their spiritual anxiety. What does it do to a man's mind to serve as society's agent of ultimate justice? To be responsible for the final moments of human lives, year after year, for decades. The executioner became an expert in human nature, in ways that even doctors and priests couldn't match. He observed every variation of how people face their final moments. Some faced death with prayers on their lips. Others expressed anger at everyone present. Some seemed to find peace in their last seconds, while others fought fate with every fiber of their being. He learned to read the signs of human emotion with supernatural accuracy, the way breathing changed under stress, the look that came over someone's face when they realized their situation was truly hopeless, the exact moment when resignation replaced resistance. This intimate knowledge of human psychology was both a professional necessity and a psychological burden. Many executioners developed what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They would wake screaming from nightmares where every person whose death they had overseen came back to accuse them. They would see faces in shadows, hear voices in the wind. They would become obsessively religious, attending church services where no one wanted them. praying constantly for forgiveness for duties they had performed in service to the state. Others went the opposite direction, becoming coldly detached from human suffering. They would develop clinical attitudes about their work, treat the legal process with administrative efficiency, approach human tragedy with professional distance. This wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. The human mind can only process so much trauma before it starts shutting down emotional responses as a defense mechanism. Some executioners became alcoholics, drowning their trauma in whatever drink they could afford or make themselves. Others became hermits, withdrawing so completely from human contact that they were barely seen except when their services were required. A few became religious fanatics, convincing themselves that they were God's instruments of justice, that every legal proceeding they oversaw was divinely ordained. But perhaps the most tragic were those who became trapped in cycles of escalating emotional numbness. Each official duty became easier to handle psychologically, and that ease terrified them. They would lie awake, wondering what they were becoming, whether they were losing their humanity bit by bit, with each life that passed through their care. The executioner lived in a unique form of psychological purgatory. He was neither criminal nor respectable citizen, neither monster nor saint, neither damned nor saved. He existed in the liminal space between law and morality, and that space was a very lonely place to live. Professional executioners often developed sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms that allowed them to function despite impossible circumstances. They might compartmentalize their official duties, treating them as completely separate from their personal lives. They might develop elaborate justification systems that explained how their work served greater good. They might create mental rituals that helped them process trauma in manageable doses. The process of becoming an executioner was perhaps one of the most psychologically damaging experiences in medieval life. Young men, usually sons of executioners, but sometimes individuals appointed by legal authorities, had to be gradually introduced to the administrative and practical aspects of capital punishment. The training began with observation. A young apprentice would watch his master work, learning to understand legal procedures, court protocols, and the administrative requirements of their profession. He learned to read legal documents, understand judicial decisions, and recognize the subtle signs that indicated when proceedings were going smoothly or facing complications. But observation was only the beginning. The apprentice had to learn to prepare documentation, to maintain official records. To assist with the administrative aspects of legal proceedings, he would study court procedures, practice official protocols, organize case files. These tasks seemed mundane, but they were crucial for ensuring that legal processes proceeded according to established law. Gradually, the apprentice would take on more direct responsibilities. He might help with crowd control during public proceedings, assist with facility preparation, or manage logistics during particularly complex cases. Each step brought him closer to the moment when he would have to oversee legal proceedings himself. The first independent assignment was always traumatic. Master executioners understood this, and they tried to choose the apprentice's first case carefully. Ideally, it would involve someone who had committed particularly serious crimes, someone whose legal fate would seem justified even to a young person struggling with the moral implications of their profession. But no amount of preparation could truly ready someone for the reality of being responsible for another person's final moments. The apprentice would often struggle with nausea, shaking hands, or paralyzing anxiety. Some young men broke down completely during their first independent assignments, unable to complete their duties and having to be replaced by their masters. Those who managed to complete their first case faced a different challenge. The realization that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were now officially responsible for overseeing the end of human lives, regardless of legal authorization or social necessity. This realization often triggered profound psychological changes, forcing young men to develop new identities built around their capacity to handle society's darkest duties. The master executioner had to serve not just as technical instructor, but as counselor, helping his apprentice process the emotional trauma of their position while maintaining the professional detachment necessary for continued service. This was a delicate balance. Too much emotion would make the work impossible, but too little would create someone dangerous to society. Many apprentice executioners struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and depression during their training period. They would wake screaming from dreams where their cases returned to haunt them. They would develop obsessive behaviors around their documentation, checking and rechecking procedures to ensure they wouldn't make errors during crucial moments. The life of an executioner varied significantly depending on where in medieval Europe he practiced his profession. Understanding these variations helps illuminate the complex relationship between executioners and the societies they served. In Germanic territories, executioners often came from established dynasties that traced their lineage back generations. These families developed sophisticated administrative systems and took pride in their professional competence. A German executioner might own several villages' worth of land, paid for with generations of legal fees. But even wealthy executioner families remained social outcasts, unable to buy their way into respectability, no matter how much gold they accumulated. French executioners operated under more formal legal frameworks, with standardized procedures and official recognition from the crown. The position was often hereditary but required formal appointment by royal officials. French society developed elaborate protocols around legal proceedings, with different procedures prescribed for different social classes and types of crimes. This systematization provided more security for executioner families, but also made escape from the profession more difficult. English executioners were often part-time appointees, serving local sheriffs or magistrates as needed. This meant that many English executioners maintained other professions, becoming known as the magistrate blacksmith or the legal officer baker. While this arrangement allowed for more normal social integration, it also meant that these men faced constant reminders of their dual nature. Respected craftsmen by day, agents of legal authority when duty called, Italian city-states frequently imported their executioners from other regions, believing that foreign officials would be more objective and less likely to be influenced by local politics. This created a class of wandering legal officers who moved from city to city, never developing roots in any community. These men often became highly skilled professionals, but they lived lives of even greater isolation than their stationary counterparts. Spanish executioners operated under the influence of both civil and religious authorities, often serving the Inquisition as well as secular courts. This dual role made them particularly feared and reviled, as they were associated with both temporal punishment and spiritual persecution. Spanish executioners often developed elaborate religious rituals around their work, seeking divine sanction for actions that many believers considered morally questionable. Beyond market days and religious services, executioners had limited opportunities for human interaction, and those opportunities were fraught with tension and complexity. Official business occasionally required executioners to meet with legal authorities, court officials, and other government representatives. These interactions were usually brief and strictly professional, but they provided some of the executioner's few experiences of being treated with something approaching respect. Officials needed the executioner's services and couldn't afford to alienate him completely, so these meetings often involved a careful balance of professional courtesy and personal distance. Interaction with other social outcasts formed another small avenue for human connection. Executioners might develop relationships with tanners, gravediggers, prostitutes, and others whose professions placed them on society's margins. These relationships were often characterized by mutual understanding and shared experience of rejection, creating bonds that couldn't exist with mainstream society. Some executioners formed professional networks with their counterparts in other regions. They might correspond through letters, sharing techniques and experiences, providing each other with emotional support that no one else could offer. These relationships were often the closest thing to friendship that executioners could maintain. The executioner's interaction with his own family was both his greatest source of comfort and his greatest source of pain. His wife and children were the only people who could see him as fully human, rather than as a professional function. Yet his love for them was also a constant reminder of what his profession had cost them. The normal lives they could never have, the social connections they would always be denied. Family gatherings in executioner households were often bittersweet affairs. Celebrations were muted by awareness of their social situation. Holiday traditions were adapted to accommodate their isolation. Children's achievements were acknowledged privately rather than shared with communities that would never accept them. The psychological toll of limited social interaction was enormous. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, and the enforced isolation experienced by executioner families violated basic human needs for community, acceptance, and belonging. The resulting psychological damage often manifested as depression, anxiety, paranoia, and other mental health problems that medieval society had no effective treatments for. Some executioners attempted to create artificial social connections through correspondence, storytelling, or imaginative role-play. They might write elaborate letters to fictional recipients, create detailed fantasy scenarios where they lived normal lives, or develop internal dialogues with imaginary friends who accepted them unconditionally. Others found solace in relationships with animals who didn't judge them based on their professions. Executioner families often kept numerous pets, dogs, cats, birds, or farm animals that provided companionship and emotional support. These animal relationships sometimes became the strongest emotional bonds in the executioner's life. Beyond the social isolation and psychological trauma, executioners carried a unique form of responsibility that few other medieval professionals faced. They were personally accountable for ensuring that legal proceedings were carried out according to law, that justice was served according to established precedent, and that social order was maintained through their actions. This responsibility was both legal and moral. If an executioner made errors in his duties, he could face serious legal consequences, fines, imprisonment, or even capital punishment himself. But the moral responsibility was even heavier. Every decision he made, every procedure he followed, every case he handled had profound consequences for real people and their families. The weight of making life and death decisions took a tremendous toll on executioners' mental health. They couldn't simply follow orders blindly. They had to understand the legal basis for their actions, evaluate the evidence against the accused, and ensure that proper procedures were followed. This required them to engage intellectually and emotionally with each case, making the psychological burden even heavier. Executioners often developed obsessive perfectionism as a way of managing this responsibility. They would review case files repeatedly, double-check legal documentation, and verify procedural requirements multiple times. This attention to detail was professionally necessary but psychologically exhausting. The knowledge that mistakes could have catastrophic consequences created chronic anxiety for many executioners. They lived in constant fear of errors that could result in wrongful punishment, procedural violations that could invalidate legal decisions, or administrative failures that could undermine the entire justice system. Some executioners found the weight of responsibility so overwhelming that they developed decision-making paralysis. They would delay proceedings while seeking additional confirmation, request second opinions on routine matters, or refuse to act without explicit written authorization for every detail of their duties. Others became hypervigilant about potential problems, seeing threats and complications everywhere. They might interpret innocent comments as challenges to their authority, view routine questions as attempts to undermine their work, or perceive normal administrative requests as personal attacks. The responsibility for maintaining professional equipment and facilities added another layer of stress. Executioners had to ensure that all tools were in perfect working condition, that facilities met legal requirements, and that procedures could be carried out safely and efficiently. Equipment failures or facility problems could result in botched proceedings that reflected poorly on the executioner's competence. One of the few ways medieval executioners could maintain connection with the outside world was through correspondence with others in their profession. These letters provide some of our most intimate glimpses into the psychological reality of executioner life. Executioner correspondence often focused on practical matters, sharing techniques, discussing legal changes, requesting advice about difficult cases. But between the lines of these professional communications, we can read the deep loneliness and isolation that characterized executioner life. Letters between executioners frequently contained coded language that allowed them to discuss their emotional struggles without explicitly acknowledging the psychological damage of their work. They might refer to difficult assignments when describing cases that had traumatized them, or mention professional challenges when discussing suicidal thoughts. Some executioner families maintained extensive correspondence networks that spanned multiple countries and generations. These letter-writing traditions served as informal support systems, providing emotional sustenance that couldn't be obtained. Locally, children grew up learning to read and write, primarily so they could participate in these family communication networks. The letters often contained practical advice for managing social isolation. Experienced executioners would share strategies for dealing with hostile communities, techniques for finding merchants willing to serve them, or methods for protecting their families from social retaliation. Religious themes were common in executioner correspondence. They would discuss theological questions raised by their work, share prayers they had found comforting, or seek spiritual guidance from others who faced similar moral dilemmas. These religious discussions served both practical and psychological functions, helping executioners maintain faith while processing guilt and trauma. Some letters contained detailed descriptions of local customs and legal procedures, serving as professional development resources for executioners in other regions. These technical discussions helped maintain professional standards while also providing intellectual stimulation for men whose daily lives offered few opportunities for meaningful conversation. Family news formed another important component of executioner correspondence. Letters would include updates about marriages, births, deaths, and other significant events in executioner families. These communications helped maintain family connections across vast distances and provided emotional support for isolated family members. The correspondence also served as historical record, documenting changes in legal systems, social attitudes, and professional practices over time. Modern historians have used executioner letters to understand medieval justice systems, social structures, and attitudes toward capital punishment. As executioners aged, they faced unique challenges that other medieval workers never had to consider. There was no retirement from the profession. Only death could release an executioner from his obligations. But age brought physical and mental limitations that made the work increasingly difficult and dangerous. An older executioner might find his hands shaking at crucial moments, his memory failing when legal precedents were essential, his concentration inadequate for the administrative demands of his profession. A mistake in legal proceedings wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially fatal for his career and dangerous for the community he served. The accumulation of trauma also took its toll. An executioner who had served for 30 or 40 years carried psychological burdens that would have crushed most people. He had overseen hundreds or thousands of final moments, had been responsible for more endings than soldiers in major battles. The weight of all those lives, all those families, all those legal decisions could become overwhelming. Many aging executioners developed physical symptoms related to their psychological stress, chronic headaches, digestive problems, joint pain that seemed to have no medical cause. Their bodies were breaking down under the weight of what their minds had endured. Some old executioners became increasingly religious, spending their final years in desperate attempts to find spiritual peace for what they saw as a lifetime of moral compromise. They would give away their accumulated wealth to churches and charities, hoping to demonstrate their commitment to Christian values. They might become hermits, withdrawing from even the limited social contact they had maintained during their working years. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming bitter and cynical about human nature and social justice. They had seen too much of humanity's capacity for cruelty, had witnessed too many examples of injustice masquerading as law. These executioners might become harsh and unforgiving, taking out their accumulated anger on anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. The question of succession was always present in an aging executioner's mind. Would his son take over the family responsibility? Was there another candidate who could be trained to replace him? What would happen to his wife and other dependents if he died without arranging for a successor? Some executioners tried to train multiple apprentices, hoping to ensure continuity of service while also providing themselves with backup options. But training executioners was expensive and time-consuming, and there was always the risk that an apprentice might flee rather than complete his preparation. The death of an executioner often created administrative problems for local authorities. If he died without a trained replacement, the region might be left without the means to carry out legal proceedings. This could lead to delays in justice, accumulation of pending cases, and political pressure to find solutions quickly. The women in an executioner's life faced unique challenges that in many ways exceeded even his own suffering. While the executioner himself was feared and avoided, the women associated with him were often viewed with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and disgust. An executioner's wife lived in a social limbo. She couldn't participate in the normal activities of medieval women, the communal washing, the market gossip, the church socializing that formed the backbone of female community life. Other women would cross themselves when she approached, as if her very presence carried contamination from her husband's profession. Finding a wife in the first place was nearly impossible for executioners. Most came from executioner families themselves, daughters of legal officers who married sons of legal officers, creating dynasties that lasted for centuries. These marriages were often arranged affairs, with families trading children like pieces on a chessboard to maintain the bloodlines necessary for their profession. The few women who married into executioner families from outside often came from desperate circumstances. They might be widows with children to feed, women fleeing abusive situations, or those whose own social standing was already so low that association with an executioner represented a step up rather than a step down. An executioner's wife had to be strong in ways that other medieval women never needed to consider. She might have to tend her husband's psychological wounds after particularly difficult cases, helping him process trauma that he couldn't discuss. With anyone else, she had to create a home environment that provided refuge from a hostile world, offering comfort and normalcy in a life defined by official duty and social isolation. These women often became experts at reading their husbands' moods, learning to recognize the signs of an approaching breakdown or a particularly difficult assignment. They developed strategies for managing the household when their husband was too traumatized to function, taking over responsibilities that normally would have fallen to the male head of household. The children of executioners faced their own unique challenges, with daughters bearing a particularly heavy burden. An executioner's daughter had virtually no chance of marrying outside the narrow circle of other disgraced families. She would typically become the wife of another legal officer, or perhaps marry into families of tanners, gravediggers, or other socially marginal professions. These young women grew up knowing their futures were predetermined. They would spend their lives in isolation, caring for men whose work traumatized them daily, raising children who would face the same stigma they had endured. The cycle would continue generation after generation, with no hope of escape or redemption. What happened to executioner families after the patriarch died? The answer varied depending on circumstances, but it was rarely pleasant for those left behind. If the executioner had sons, the eldest would typically inherit both the position and its burdens. This succession wasn't automatic. Local authorities had to approve the appointment, and not all sons were suitable for the role. Some lacked the administrative skills necessary for the work. Others lacked the psychological fortitude to handle the isolation and trauma. A son who refused to take on his father's profession faced serious consequences. He might lose legal protection himself, or be banished from the region entirely. Some sons fled rather than accept their inherited fate, disappearing into distant cities where they hoped to start new lives under assumed identities. The daughters of deceased executioners faced different but equally challenging circumstances. With their father dead, and their brothers either serving as executioners themselves or fled, these women often had no male protection in a society that offered little support for unprotected females. They might be forced into marginal employment, or into marriages with other socially marginal men who were willing to accept wives with such damaged reputations. Executioner widows had perhaps the most difficult situation of all. They were too old to remarry easily, too stigmatized to find respectable employment, too traumatized by years of isolation to integrate easily into normal society. Many ended their days as dependents on church charity or living in poverty on the edges of towns that had never accepted them. Some executioner families tried to break the cycle by abandoning their inherited profession entirely. They would destroy their professional documents, sell their equipment, and attempt to disappear into anonymity. But medieval Europe was a small world, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. A family might spend years building new identities, only to have someone from their hometown arrive and destroy everything they'd worked to create. The accumulated wealth of successful executioner families sometimes helped with these transitions. Money could buy new identities, transportation to distant regions, or investment in legitimate businesses operated under assumed names, but it could also attract unwanted attention from authorities who expected executioner families to continue serving. The physical legacy of executioner families was often deliberately erased. Their houses might be abandoned or destroyed after their deaths, their possessions scattered or burned, their grave markers removed or defaced. Society wanted to eliminate even the memory of these necessary but unwanted servants of justice. Yet in some ways, executioner families left lasting marks on their communities. The administrative procedures they developed, the legal precedents they established, the institutional knowledge they accumulated often outlasted the individuals who created them. Their professional expertise became part of the institutional memory of legal systems, passed down through official channels rather than family traditions. The executioner's experience provides a unique window into the psychological reality of medieval justice systems. Unlike modern legal professionals who maintain distance from the consequences of their work, medieval executioners were intimately involved with every aspect of the justice process from arrest to final punishment. This intimate involvement created psychological burdens that modern people can barely imagine. The executioner wasn't just implementing policy. He was personally responsible for the human consequences of legal decisions. He saw the fear in condemned people's eyes, heard their final words, witnessed their family's grief. He carried all of this human suffering as personal burden. The cumulative effect of this responsibility was profound psychological damage that affected not just executioners themselves, but entire family lines. Children grew up in households shadowed by trauma. Wives lived with men whose work had broken them psychologically, and communities struggled with the knowledge of what they were requiring fellow humans to endure. Medieval society attempted to manage this psychological burden through various mechanisms. The executioner's hood served not just to protect his identity, but to symbolically separate the man from his function. Elaborate legal ceremonies helped transform personal killing into official state action. Religious rituals attempted to provide divine sanction for morally questionable activities. But these mechanisms were ultimately inadequate for protecting human psychology from the trauma of repeated involvement with death and suffering. The executioner's mental health problems, social dysfunction, and family breakdown represented the true cost of medieval justice systems, costs that were largely invisible to the communities that benefited from these services. The relationship between money and moral compromise in the executioner's life reveals important truths about human psychology and social organization. Despite their social rejection, most executioners were well compensated for their services, creating complex psychological relationships with their profession. Some executioners developed guilt about profiting from activities they found morally troubling. They would give away large portions of their fees to charity, live in deliberate poverty despite substantial income, or refuse payment for certain types of cases. This financial self-punishment served as a form of psychological penance that helped them maintain moral identity despite professional requirements. Others embraced their financial success as validation for their social sacrifice. They reasoned that society's willingness to pay well for their services proved that the work was necessary and valuable. Regardless of social attitudes, These executioners might live lavishly, accumulating wealth and property as compensation for their isolation and stigma. The inability to spend money normally due to merchants' refusal to serve them or social boycotts of their patronage created unique psychological pressures. Wealth that couldn't be enjoyed became a source of frustration rather than comfort. Executioners might accumulate vast fortunes while living in practical poverty due to their inability to convert money into goods and services. Some executioner families developed elaborate schemes for laundering their wealth through intermediaries and false identities. They might invest in businesses operated by distant relatives, purchase property through third parties, or create complex financial arrangements that obscured the source of their money. These efforts required enormous time and energy, but provided psychological relief by allowing some normal economic participation. The generational transmission of both wealth and stigma created additional psychological complexities. Executioner. Children might inherit substantial money, along with social rejection, giving them resources they couldn't use effectively. This combination of wealth and isolation often led to psychological problems that persisted throughout their lives. The executioner's role in medieval society serves as a classic example of scapegoating, the psychological and social process by which communities manage guilt and anxiety by projecting them onto designated individuals or groups. Medieval communities needed violence to maintain social order, but they also needed to maintain moral identity as Christian societies. This created a fundamental contradiction that was resolved through the creation of executioner roles that allowed violence while preserving community innocence. By treating executioners as morally contaminated figures, communities could maintain the fiction that they were not responsible for the violence committed in their name. The executioner became a repository for collective guilt, allowing everyone else to feel morally clean, despite their participation in systems that required killing. This scapegoating process was psychologically necessary for medieval communities, but devastatingly harmful for executioner families. They were forced to carry not just their own moral burden, but also the displaced guilt of entire communities. This psychological load was far heavier than any individual could reasonably be expected to bear. The community's need to maintain the executioner's outsider status also explains why social acceptance was impossible, regardless of the executioner's personal behavior. If executioners were treated normally, the scapegoating process would break down and communities would be forced to confront their own complicity in violence. The executioner's isolation thus served important psychological functions for medieval society, but at enormous human cost. The system worked from the community's perspective. Justice was served, order was maintained, moral identity was preserved, but the price was paid entirely by executioner families, who were sacrificed to maintain everyone else's psychological comfort. The executioner profession created unique patterns of trauma transmission that affected families for generations. Children born into executioner families inherited not just social stigma, but also psychological damage that shaped their entire lives. Executioner fathers often struggled to maintain normal parental relationships while carrying the emotional burden of their work. They might be loving and gentle with their children while simultaneously preparing them for lives of isolation and rejection. This contradiction created confusing messages that children had difficulty processing. Mothers in executioner families faced the impossible task of creating nurturing environments while managing their own trauma and social isolation. They had to prepare their children for harsh social realities while also providing the emotional support necessary for healthy development. Children learned from early ages that their family was different, dangerous somehow, unacceptable to normal society. They developed hypervigilance about social interactions, constantly alert for signs of discovery or rejection. This early trauma often persisted throughout their lives, affecting their ability to form relationships, even with others who shared their social status. The lack of normal social development opportunities meant that executioner children often reached adulthood with significant psychological deficits. They might struggle with anxiety in social situations, have difficulty reading normal social cues, or lack the interpersonal skills necessary for building relationships outside their immediate family. Some executioner families developed their own cultural traditions and practices that helped maintain family identity despite social rejection. They might create private ceremonies to mark important life events, develop family traditions that didn't require community participation, or maintain oral histories that preserved family dignity despite public disgrace. These alternative cultural practices served important psychological functions, providing meaning and identity for people who were denied normal social roles. But they also further isolated executioner families from mainstream society, creating distinctive subcultures that were increasingly difficult to integrate with normal community life. Despite their social isolation, executioners maintained complex relationships with the legal and political authorities who employed them. These relationships were characterized by mutual dependence and mutual distrust that created ongoing psychological tension. Authorities needed executioners to maintain social order and implement legal decisions, but they also needed to maintain distance from the moral contamination associated with capital punishment. This led to official relationships that were formally respectful, but personally distant. Executioners were often excluded from court social events, despite their official positions. They might be required to attend legal proceedings, but forbidden from participating in the social activities that surrounded them. They served justice but were not allowed to socialize with other servants of justice. Political changes could dramatically affect executioner families overnight. A new ruler might decide to reform legal systems, replace professional executioners with temporary appointees, or eliminate certain forms of capital punishment entirely. These changes could destroy executioner livelihoods without warning or compensation. Some executioners developed political skills that helped them navigate changing circumstances. They learned to read political winds, anticipate policy changes, and maintain relationships with multiple authorities to ensure continued employment. But these political activities required them to engage with systems that simultaneously needed and rejected them. The executioner's access to sensitive information about legal proceedings, political decisions, and community conflicts made him both valuable and dangerous to authorities. He knew which cases were politically motivated, which legal decisions were influenced by corruption, and which authorities were acting outside established law. This knowledge provided some protection, but also made him a potential target for elimination. The financial realities of executioner families reveal important truths about medieval economic systems and social organization. Despite substantial income from professional services, these families often lived in practical poverty due to social and economic isolation. Executioner families typically paid premium prices for basic goods and services when they could obtain them at all. Food, clothing, housing, and other necessities cost them far more than they cost other families with similar incomes. This economic penalty was society's way of expressing disapproval while still allowing necessary commercial transactions. Investment opportunities were severely limited for executioner families. They couldn't join guilds, participate in trading, ventures, or invest in businesses that required social acceptance. Their wealth remained largely liquid, coins and precious objects that could be hidden but couldn't be used productively. Property ownership presented particular challenges. While executioners could technically own land and buildings, their property values were always depressed due to association with their profession. Neighboring landowners would organize boycotts, local authorities might impose special taxes, and potential buyers would demand substantial discounts to compensate for social stigma. Some executioner families attempted to invest through intermediaries, using distant relatives or hired agents to purchase property and operate businesses. But these arrangements were risky and often unsuccessful. The intermediaries might steal the money, the investments might fail, or the executioner's involvement might be discovered and destroy the enterprise. The inability to use wealth normally created psychological pressures that compounded other aspects of executioner family trauma. Money that couldn't buy acceptance, comfort, or security felt meaningless. Wealth without social utility became a burden rather than a blessing. The spiritual life of medieval executioners was characterized by ongoing struggle between professional obligations and religious teachings. This struggle shaped their personalities, their relationships, and their understanding of their place. In God's plan, many executioners developed highly personalized religious practices that attempted to reconcile their work with Christian teachings. They might pray for the souls of everyone involved in legal proceedings, maintain elaborate personal shrines, or undertake pilgrimages to holy sites seeking forgiveness and spiritual guidance. Some became convinced that their profession was part of divine plan, that God needed human instruments to implement earthly justice, and that they had been chosen for this difficult but necessary service. This interpretation provided psychological comfort, but also isolated them from mainstream religious community that couldn't accept such theological reasoning. Others lived in constant spiritual anguish, convinced that their professional duties condemned them to eternal punishment, regardless of their personal intentions or moral struggles. These executioners might engage in extreme religious practices, excessive fasting, self-punishment, or obsessive prayer, attempting to earn forgiveness for sins they felt compelled to commit. The executioner's relationship with local clergy was particularly complex. Priests needed executioner services for dealing with religious crimes and maintaining church authority, but they also needed to maintain spiritual distance from violence and death. This led to professional relationships characterized by formal courtesy and personal rejection. Some executioners found spiritual comfort in mystical religious traditions that emphasize personal relationship with God over community acceptance. They might develop private prayer practices, study religious texts independently, or create personal theological frameworks that didn't require external validation. The question of salvation remained central to most executioners' spiritual lives. They spent enormous mental energy trying to understand whether their professional duties would affect their eternal fate, whether faithful service to earthly authority would be recognized by divine authority, and whether their personal moral struggles would be taken into account in final judgment. Understanding the mundane details of executioner daily life reveals the grinding psychological toll of complete social isolation. Every ordinary activity that other people took for granted became a challenge for executioner families. Morning routines were structured around avoidance rather than engagement. The executioner would rise early to minimize encounters with neighbors, plan routes through town that avoided busy areas, and time his activities to when respectable people were occupied elsewhere. Meals were often solitary affairs, even within executioner families. The psychological weight of the profession affected appetite and digestion, leading many executioners to eat mechanically rather than for pleasure. Family meals were shadowed by awareness of their social situation and uncertainty about their future. Work routines varied depending on whether legal proceedings were scheduled. During busy periods, executioners might be required to prepare extensively, reviewing case files, organizing equipment, and coordinating with authorities. During quiet periods, they faced the psychological challenge of waiting for the next assignment while managing anxiety about what it might involve. Exercise and recreation were severely limited by social isolation. Executioners couldn't participate in community sports, social gatherings, or public entertainments. They had to find solitary activities that could be pursued without community involvement. Walking in isolated areas, tending private gardens, or engaging in crafts that didn't require social interaction. Evening routines often focused on psychological management rather than relaxation. Executioners might engage in prayer, meditation, or other practices designed to process the emotional content of their days. They might read when materials were available, write in private journals, or engage in other activities that provided mental stimulation without requiring social engagement. Sleep was often elusive due to anxiety, guilt, and trauma-related nightmares. Many executioners developed elaborate bedtime routines designed to promote rest and ward off disturbing dreams. They might pray extensively before sleep, arrange their sleeping spaces to feel secure, or use alcohol or herbal remedies to promote unconsciousness. The way executioners and their families communicated reveals important aspects of their psychological adaptation to extreme social circumstances. Living in complete isolation created unique linguistic patterns and communication styles. The way executioners and their families communicated reveals important aspects of their psychological adaptation to extreme social circumstances. Living in complete isolation created unique linguistic patterns and communication styles within executioner families. Conversation often became coded and indirect. Direct discussion of professional duties was too psychologically painful, so families developed euphemisms and metaphors that allowed them to communicate about their situation without confronting its full emotional impact. Children learned to speak carefully about their family situation, understanding intuitively that honesty could be dangerous. They developed skills at misdirection and concealment that helped them navigate social situations where discovery of their background could lead to immediate rejection. Executioner families often maintained extensive correspondence with others in their profession, and these letters revealed distinctive linguistic patterns. Professional discussions used formal, legal language that maintained emotional distance from human consequences. Personal communication was often stilted and careful, reflecting the writer's limited experience with normal social interaction. The executioners themselves often became skilled at reading nonverbal communication, developing supernatural ability to interpret facial expressions, body language, and vocal tones. This skill was professionally useful, but personally exhausting, as it meant they were constantly analyzing every human interaction for signs of hostility or acceptance. Many executioners reported feeling linguistically isolated even when speaking with family members. The psychological burden of their work created internal experiences that couldn't be adequately expressed in ordinary language. They felt that their suffering was literally unspeakable, that no words existed to convey the reality of their situation to others. Some developed private languages or symbolic systems that allowed them to process their experiences internally. They might create personal codes for recording their thoughts, develop artistic or musical expressions for emotions that couldn't be verbalized, or engage in other creative activities that provided psychological outlet. Perhaps no one in medieval society understood the practical realities of justice systems better than the executioners who implemented them. Their unique position provided insights into law, morality, and social organization that were available to few others. Executioners witnessed every aspect of legal proceedings from investigation through final punishment. They saw how evidence was gathered and evaluated, how political considerations influenced legal decisions, and how social status affected judicial outcomes. This comprehensive view often led to cynicism about justice systems that claimed divine sanction and moral authority. Many executioners developed sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and precedents that rivaled that of trained lawyers. They had to understand the law thoroughly to perform their duties effectively, but their practical experience often revealed gaps between legal theory and real-world application. The executioner's close contact with condemned individuals provided him with insights into crime, punishment, and social control that were unavailable to other legal professionals. He learned to distinguish between different types of criminals, to understand the social factors that led to criminal behavior, and to recognize patterns in legal outcomes that reflected social biases rather than objective justice. This intimate knowledge of justice systems' flaws and biases created additional psychological burden for executioners. They were required to implement decisions they often knew were unjust, to participate in proceedings they recognized as corrupted by politics or prejudice, to serve systems they understood were fundamentally flawed. Some executioners channeled their understanding of legal systems into advocacy for reform. They might write letters to authorities suggesting procedural improvements, advocate for more humane treatment of condemned individuals, or argue for legal changes that would make justice more effective and less traumatic. Others became completely cynical about justice, viewing their work as simply another form of violence, sanctioned by power rather than morality. These executioners might become harsh and indifferent, treating legal proceedings as administrative matters rather than moral enterprises. As our long journey through the executioner's world draws to a close, it's important to understand what we can learn from these forgotten lives about humanity, justice, and the costs of civilization. The medieval executioner was caught in contradictions that reveal fundamental tensions in human society. Communities needed order, but rejected those who maintained it. People demanded justice, but despised those who delivered it. Society required violence, but condemned those willing to commit it. On behalf of others, these contradictions weren't accidental. They were logical consequences of trying to maintain moral authority while requiring morally questionable actions. Every community that employed executioners faced the same dilemma: how to preserve spiritual purity while demanding service that compromised the souls of those who provided it. The executioner's isolation was society's attempt to solve this dilemma by creating scapegoat figures who could absorb moral contamination on behalf of the community. By treating executioners as less than human, society could maintain the fiction that necessary violence was performed by monsters rather than by ordinary people serving social needs. But this solution created its own problems. The executioners remained human despite society's attempts to dehumanize them. They felt guilt, fear, love, and pain just like everyone else. They formed families, sought meaning in their lives, and struggled with the moral implications of their actions. Their humanity couldn't be erased by community rejection. The psychological damage inflicted on executioner families represents one of history's great injustices. These people were condemned to lives of suffering not for their own crimes, but for serving social functions that communities deemed necessary but morally unacceptable. They were punished for doing what they were required to do, hated for providing services that others demanded. Yet the executioner's story also reveals remarkable human resilience, despite impossible circumstances. Many of these men and women maintained their dignity, their compassion, and their commitment to serving their duties as humanely as possible. They found ways to love and be loved, to create meaning in their lives, to preserve hope despite overwhelming despair. The executioner families who endured generation after generation of isolation and trauma demonstrate the human capacity to survive almost anything. They developed strategies for coping with social rejection, methods for maintaining family bonds under extreme stress, and techniques for preserving mental health in the face of constant psychological assault. Understanding the executioner's experience illuminates the true price of justice systems based on retribution and social exclusion. Every legal proceeding created ripple effects that extended far beyond the condemned individual. Families were destroyed, communities were traumatized, and individuals were psychologically damaged in ways that lasted for generations. The executioner served as the human embodiment of society's darkest necessities. He was the living reminder of what communities were willing to do to maintain order, the visible symbol of violence lurking beneath civilization's polite surface. His suffering was the price paid for everyone else's comfort and security. Medieval society's treatment of executioners reveals important truths about how communities manage moral responsibility. When societies require individuals to perform actions that violate community moral standards, they typically respond by excluding those individuals from moral community rather than questioning the actions themselves. This pattern of moral exclusion and scapegoating isn't limited to medieval times. It appears throughout human history whenever communities need violence but want to maintain moral innocence. The executioner's story provides insight into ongoing human struggles with violence, authority, and social responsibility. The psychological damage suffered by executioner families also reveals the limitations of individual resilience when facing systemic oppression. No amount of personal strength, religious faith, or family support could fully protect these people from the psychological consequences of complete social rejection combined with professional trauma. The executioner's world teaches us profound lessons about human nature, social organization, and the costs of civilization. These lessons remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with questions about justice, violence, and social responsibility. First, the executioner's story reveals how easily ordinary people can be transformed into social outcasts by circumstances beyond their control. The men who became executioners weren't born monsters. They were created by social systems that needed their services, but couldn't acknowledge their humanity. Second, The treatment of executioner families demonstrates how social stigma can become hereditary, condemning entire family lines to suffering for the actions of individual members. This pattern of collective punishment reveals the dangers of judging people based on association rather than personal behavior.